Scared Stiff Part 10. Next thing he knew, he was sitting in the psychologist's office, slumped in a chair. He could still feel his hands trembling, but couldn't stop them. He wasn't sure he wanted to. If he stopped shaking, it might mean he'd truly die. He'd felt like he wanted to die, ever since he was told he was actually going to serve time in a detention center. He hadn't expected time in a youth detention center, though he'd suspected that might be the case when the lawyer had told him the prosecution had a tough stance on bullies. What had surprised him most was that there were a lot of kids that were far more aggressive than he ever thought about being. He'd never even considered carrying a weapon because he'd always been too quick with his hands. The kids that were in the center with him seemed to materialize weapons out of virtually nothing. One kid had surprised him with a sharpened end of a toothbrush in the shower for inadvertently grabbing his shampoo. He didn't want to see the psychologist. He wanted to go home, at his aunt and uncle's home, where he could play video games and watch television. He wanted to go see Callie and apologize, and he wasn't sure what else, but he knew he had to do something to set things right. He was glad the fight hadn't happened on school grounds. He didn't know what would happen if that had been taken from him as well. The problem was, it wasn't going to be so simple to go back to school. He just couldn't pick up and go on as though nothing had happened. He'd screwed up, big time, and even though he knew things would fly under the radar as far as the teachers were concerned, they all liked him, and had counseled him a lot about his temper. This was a small town, and he knew the other kids would have heard about his record. He also knew that his story had hit the newspapers. All cases generally did, though they tended to disappear shortly thereafter from the press radar screens. He glanced up quickly from his thoughts when the door opened, looking sullenly at the slender woman who entered. Dr. Faraday was the center psychologist, a friendly, gentle woman by all accounts. She usually saw everyone within a month of intake, and his initial visit with her had been fairly uneventful. She'd dealt with him after he'd gotten badly beaten shortly after his arrival at the center, had commented that it was normal to feel the after effects of an assault long after the event had actually taken place. But this event with Blaster was more than enough. He'd seen the look in Blaster's face. He'd too easily recognized the look of blatant fury. Jimmy had felt that same look on his own face. "Hey, Doc," he mumbled. Her smile was warm, and for a brief moment, all Jimmy wanted was a hug from her. He knew, however, that such a move would have landed him in serious hot water, though he suspected that the young doctor was likely a hugger. He longed for one. He'd never really gotten hugs from anyone except his aunt. He sniffled, swiping the back of his hand under his nose again. For one of the few times he could remember, he was ready to cry. "Jimmy, you know why you're here, right?" Her voice was gentle, and Jimmy's heart ached. He'd never let go of his emotions, not even once. His father told him he needed to be a man, which meant he frequently had to swallow tears and bite back his anger. Now he was a powder keg, stuck in a detention center, though his time in was going to be short. "I'm okay, Doc," he told her. "He didn't hurt me. Just gave me a good shove." She glanced up from the file she was reading. "Jimmy, the kid who grabbed you is named Blake, and he would have killed you, given the opportunity. You know that, right?" Her voice was so casual. Jimmy said nothing, waiting for the catch, wanting his heart to stop pounding. When he didn't speak, she continued, "Jimmy, you're a good kid by all accounts. You've got good grades and a bad handle on your temper. Why are you here?" Jimmy thought, all the past kids he'd threatened suddenly flashing through his head. He could see the genuine confusion on each of their faces now, and after a while, the fear. Dr. Faraday was right. What the hell had he done to get here? And now, he was the target of a kid younger but not smaller than him. What had his uncle said? That there was always someone bigger and tougher than he was. It was a hell of a thing to be faced with the possibility of your own death at 17, and at the hands of another boy close to your own age. When he spoke again, he sounded unbelievably exhausted and terribly old. "I want to go home." Dr. Faraday looked at her patient sympathetically. She went over Jimmy's case file exhaustively and knew intuitively how a bully had been born. Throw in some jealousy, observation of parents constantly at war with each other with poor coping strategies, and a curious toddler and boom. A 17-year-old with flying fists is made. To Jimmy, she said, "I know you do. What's going to happen after you get there?" He averted his gaze. It was a question he'd been contemplating virtually since he'd arrived at the detention center. He'd gotten a notoriously tough judge, one who had an incredibly stern stance on bullies, and though he'd gotten a fairly light sentence, it was one that he wasn't going to be able to forget. He shrugged, feeling a bit lost. "I dunno," he admitted, his voice soft. He pushed a lock of hair out of his eyes. "I'm just about done my time, haven't I? Couple weeks or something left." It was hard to ignore the hope in the boy's eyes. "We have a proposition for you, Jimmy. Something I worked out with probation." He leaned forward but tried not to look too interested. She knew he was on the hook, all she had to do was reel him in, and she was sure it wasn't going to take much. The boy was scared, he was scared stiff. He'd gotten a very harsh wake-up call, and it was one that many his age needed but never really saw often. She explained that she wanted him to share his story with other kids, starting with his own high school. It was hoped, she told him, trying not to sound too eager, that sharing his own story about living as a foster kid with a criminal father and an abused mother would help him come to realize there was some good to be found if he chose to go after it. Jimmy knew there was more. She didn't need to tell him that she also hoped that sharing his story would help other kids his age realize that pounding someone into dust wasn't going to help matters. Today was his biggest lesson in that. "Do we have to start at my school?" he asked, a bit petulantly. She wasn't going to make this easy, after all. When the doctor told him his uncle put up bail, he was elated yet for the first time in his life, very humble. After his meeting with Dr. Faraday, he felt a little lighter in fact, than he'd felt for most of his life. He needed to set himself right. Jimmy felt he owed something back and just maybe this was a way to do it.